Let's go Ravens. Things are heating up around the Baltimore Ravens, and we need to talk about something very important. We all know how much pressure gets placed on Lamar Jackson every time something goes wrong in Baltimore. But is that really fair? Steve Smith Sr. clearly doesn't think so, and he wasn't afraid to challenge Dan Orlovsky over it. Some people believe the biggest questions surrounding this Ravens team are on offense, especially with a young and improving wide receiver room. Others look at what happened defensively and say Lamar has been carrying blame that should be shared across the entire team. I want to know which side you're on. Do you agree with Steve Smith Sr. that people put too much responsibility on Lamar Jackson? And do you believe in this young Ravens receiving group with Zay Flowers, Rashad Bateman, Jacoby Lane, Elijah Sarrett, Tez Walker, and LaJohntay Wester? Write your opinion in the comments. And if you've been a Baltimore Ravens fan for more than 15 years, hit that like button hard. Alright, let's talk about Steve Smith Sr., Lamar Jackson, and why this debate suddenly got so heated. Now, Ravens flock, we need to start with the exchange between Steve Smith Sr. and Dan Orlovsky, because this became a very interesting conversation about what Baltimore really needs to fix and where the biggest questions are. The original question was about the key to winning the AFC North, and Steve immediately went to the identity of this division. He called it the Black and Blue Division, and then he brought the conversation directly to Lamar Jackson and Baltimore's defense. Steve's point was simple. Why does so much responsibility always end up on Lamar? He pointed toward a Ravens defense that had been ranked 30th and had allowed around 4,200 yards of offense. Then he started asking questions that sound almost ridiculous. But that was exactly why they were so effective. Is Lamar blocking somebody? No. Is Lamar handling a tight end stunt? No. Is Lamar covering somebody? No. So why, when the Baltimore Ravens have problems, does the conversation so quickly become about the quarterback? That's what Steve Smith Sr. was challenging. He reminded everybody that Baltimore has traditionally been known for defense, not just an average defense. This franchise built an identity around stopping people. Steve called it a stone-cold stopping defense. So his argument was that if we're going to evaluate the entire football team, we can't put everything on Lamar Jackson while giving other people a pass when they don't do their jobs. And this is where the discussion became even more interesting. Dan Orlovsky responded that he actually has more questions about the offense than the defense. He believes the defense has talent and that Jesse Minter can get that group playing well. But offensively, he brought up two major concerns. First, the interior offensive line. Second, the pass catchers. The offensive line question is fair. There are new pieces inside, and according to the discussion in the source, there is confidence in Voorhees, while left guard and center remain areas to watch. The preseason performance against Philadelphia also gave some reason for optimism. So there are questions, but that doesn't automatically mean panic. Then Dan moved toward the wide receivers, and that's where Steve Smith Sr. really started pushing back. Dan acknowledged Zay Flowers as a really good player. Steve immediately agreed. Then Rashad Bateman came up, with Dan mentioning that Bateman has been somewhat up and down and needs to remain healthy. After that came the young receivers. Dan questioned whether Baltimore was really going to depend on young players, such as Jacoby Lane. Steve's response? Lane catches everything. And that's important because Steve wasn't simply saying, "Trust me, he's good." He started explaining what he sees in Lane's game. Steve acknowledged that Lane had areas to improve coming out of USC, particularly when dealing with jams and creating separation against defenders. But he also emphasized what Lane brings physically. His height gives him an advantage, and when the football goes up, he can go get it. That is exactly the kind of trait that can give a quarterback confidence. Maybe a receiver doesn't create perfect separation on every snap, but if he can consistently win when the quarterback gives him an opportunity, that matters. Then Dan brought up Elijah Sarrett. Steve quickly said he can play too. He also talked about Sarrett's work ethic and said his presence can put pressure on Tez Walker. At that point, it became obvious that Steve Smith Sr. wasn't casually defending Baltimore because he once wore a Ravens uniform. He knew these receivers. He knew their strengths, their weaknesses, and the competition happening inside that room. Dan kept returning to one word, unproven. And technically, Steve didn't completely disagree. Yes, this receiver group is young. If you're looking at Zay Flowers, Rashad Bateman, Tez Walker, Jacoby Lane, Elijah Sarrett, and LaJohntay Wester, You don't have some 10-year veteran sitting inside that room. Bateman is the veteran of that group, and he is nowhere near being a 10-year NFL veteran. So yes, unproven can be used. But the real disagreement was about what that word means. Does unproven mean bad? Does unproven mean Baltimore is in trouble? Does unproven mean these players can't become productive pieces of this offense? Steve clearly doesn't believe that, and he delivered probably the most memorable line of the exchange when Dan talked about the pressure on these young players. Steve responded, "Ain't no pressure. We're not flooding the basement, baby. We're making diamonds." That tells you everything about how Steve views this situation. There are young players being tested. There are players who still need to prove themselves on Sundays. But Steve sees ability inside this group, and the evidence coming out of camp and the preseason has given Ravens fans reasons to be interested. Jacoby Lane has been catching everything in training camp.
Elijah Sarrett had a strong performance against Philadelphia outside of a fumble, which can be viewed as a rookie mistake that needs to be corrected. Zay Flowers is still Zay Flowers. Rashad Bateman had a very good training camp practice on Monday. Tez Walker has had his moments as well. So nobody needs to declare this the greatest wide receiver room in football. That's not the point. But declaring it a disaster simply because the group is young doesn't make sense either. There's risk in not having a proven veteran presence. That concern is legitimate. But there is also potential, and this new offensive structure could give these receivers more opportunities to show what they can do. That's another important part of Steve's argument. The Ravens aren't simply running back the exact same situation. There has been a change in leadership and a new offensive perspective. Steve talked about the offense sputtering, Lamar not being healthy, and the need for a new set of eyes to maximize the weapons already on this roster. That matters because Baltimore's problem wasn't necessarily a complete lack of weapons. Part of the problem was getting everybody involved. And we already saw an example of the football being spread around against Philadelphia. 5 players finished with at least 3 receptions, and 7 players had at least 3 targets. Think about what that could mean over time. If the football is being distributed to more players, defenses have more things to think about. Young receivers get opportunities to develop confidence. Established players don't have to carry everything themselves. And Lamar can attack whatever matchup the defense gives him instead of feeling like the offense has to flow through only 1 or 2 options. That could especially benefit Rashad Bateman. But then we get to the bigger subject, and this is where Steve Smith Sr.'s comments went beyond wide receivers. Lamar Jackson. Steve essentially challenged the standard being used when people discuss quarterbacks. His point was that quarterbacks receive enormous praise when teams succeed, but they also receive enormous blame when things go wrong. Meanwhile, other players can sometimes escape the same level of criticism even when they aren't doing their jobs. And with Lamar, that pressure becomes even bigger. Steve wasn't saying Lamar should never be criticized. The discussion itself acknowledged that Lamar had a role in the offense's struggles.